Hey everyone, welcome to episode number 9 of ON1 Inspiration. My name is Brian Matias. We're just one episode away from episode 10. Today we have a guest presenter. His name is Scott Davenport, and for me this is one of the coolest things when you watch Scott's episode. Scott used to watch the old series, kind of like there's Star Trek and Star Trek The Next Generation. Perfect Inspiration was a series that I started back when I was with ON1 years ago, and Scott watched it. And so for it to come full circle now, and he's an actual presenter, to me that's one of the coolest things. And I'm really thankful that he has this opportunity to share some of his work with me and with all of you. And so when you see this, it's a seascape photo. And one, I really like the way Scott presents himself. He breaks up the screencast with on-camera presentation. I think that's really slick. But he approaches his stylization in a way that I admit I never would, where usually when I'm working on a seascape photo, I typically maintain its color, or I'll accentuate it. But Scott goes a different route and is going to use a black and white toning technique that I found really cool. So without any more delay, let's check it out. And Scott, thank you very much.
Hi everybody, I'm Scott Davenport and welcome to ON1 Inspiration. It's great to be back on the series, and this series holds a special place in my heart. When Brian first launched Perfect Inspiration several years ago, like many of you, I looked forward to every episode, and certainly those videos were a big part in me incorporating ON1 into my workflow. But more importantly, Brian delivered photography knowledge, beyond just the tools, just knowledge about the craft. And so now to be here several years later and Brian introducing, one of my videos, it doesn't get cooler than that. So for those of you that know my work, you know that I'm an unabashed seascape lover. Living in San Diego means I get my year-round fix of sun, sky, and surf. However, not every day at the beach is bright and sunny, and yes, even sunny San Diego has overcast days. And that's what I want to talk about today. I'm going to share a seascape taken on one of those overcast days. These are the kind of days where it's great to look for the intimate seascape. Forget about the sky, point your camera downward, and find what's hidden in plain sight. This is the photo I'm going to process today. And I like the form and the shape of this. I chose this because of the way that these rocks are curling through. There's 3 large ones. 3 is usually a pleasing number to our brains. And also how the water is swirling around through these rocks here. Now the photo is certainly underexposed. It's very clear from the histogram. I've got really almost nothing going on up in the highlights. I chose to do that because I wanted to maintain some level of detail in these fingers of water. I'm shooting on a Sony A7R, and I know that's got a very, very good sensor. And I could have increased ISO to allow more light to get in, but keep my shutter speed in the 4-second is where this ended up, so I could have some of that detail there. I just chose to shoot a little underexposed, knowing that I can recover that detail in post. So first thing I'm going to do is take care of white balance. I will grab this eyedropper here in Lightroom. I want this to be white. I want the water to be white. And so that spot should be white. And that looks pretty good. It's about how I remember it. And now for the exposure, let's tackle that. This needs to go up at least a stop, maybe more. So let's get up to 125. That's looking pretty good. I can do some more work with the whites and the blacks if I don't want to push this too far and start to blow things out entirely and lose all detail. So let's stick with that. Now for contrast, I like to use the V key. I'm going to hold down the letter V, and that renders a black and white version of the photo. And actually just looking at it right now, I'm probably going to go in a black and white direction. Now these overcast days aren't about color. They're about shape and they're about form. So with the V key pressed, I'm going to start sliding this contrast slider up to the right, increasing the contrast. And what I'm really doing is I'm just watching the preview. I'm not looking at the slider, just watching what it's doing to the photo. And right around there, looks pretty good. All right, now to tackle some of the whites and the blacks. So I'm going to grab the whites slider, holding on the Option key, and I'm going to increase the whites. Now when I hold the Option key down and start moving the slider, everything disappears. And this is going to give me a clipping map. So as I push really far, you start to see where things start to clip. So I want to adjust it just before I see clipping. So right around there looks good. And the same thing for the blacks. I'm going to take those and darken them so I get I like to have a little bit of clipping in the blacks area. So I'm getting a little bit of clipping right in that shadow area. And I'm happy with that. Now I've lost some highlight detail. So let's bring that back with the highlight slider. Start pulling that to the left. And we're starting to see some of that highlights return, in particular the upper portion of the image. And again, I'm watching the preview window. It's the value in the slider isn't what's important. It's the result you get in the preview. That looks nice. Shadows, I'm going to open those up some. I tend to process a little more flatly in Lightroom. And then when I get into effects and start adding certain filters, the flat processing gives me a little more latitude with adding dynamic contrast or color tones or detail in black and white, whatever it might be. Speaking of detail, let's take a look at clarity. This is another slider I like to use the V key on, so I get black and white rendering. It just helps me see where the contrast, the local contrast, is being added. I'm going to nudge this up some. I don't want to go too far, because if I go too far, I almost always add dynamic contrast when I'm in effects. And that's going to be too much local contrast. If I overdo clarity here, I will not need to do dynamic contrast, or I'll want to do dynamic contrast because I get better controls there, and I just won't get a nice result because I've added too much in Lightroom. Now, these last two guys in the basic panel, I am going to play with these. Even though I'm really thinking black and white at this point, I want to have good color representation, and that will just make the black and white image stronger. And what I'm watching as I adjust vibrance and saturation is the oranges of the foreground, and notably these like little barnacles on these rocks. I think with that, I'm finished in Lightroom. So I'm going to take this over into layers. There's this one streak of seaweed through here that I find distracting. I want to take that out. And I know that the tools in layers are going to make that a lot easier than the spot removal tool in Lightroom. So let's get this over into layers. Go to File, plug in extras, and I'm going to send this right over to layers 10. All right, a brief stop in layers to take care of this little strand of seaweed here. So let's zoom in 100%, get down over here and take a look at this. Now there's a lot of texture around this, so the best tool for that is going to be the clone stamp tool. Now first I'm going to turn off the smart layer so I can reactivate those editing tools. I'm going to grab clone stamp, and I'm going to turn off my little cursor here so we can see this better. And I want to sample just to the side here. I'm going to try to divide this piece of seaweed into a few other pieces. And so something like that, I'm just using Option click. That one didn't look so good. Let's be a little more precise. Option click to set the sample point, and then wiggle that around there a little bit, and slowly work my way around this piece. And as I get to smaller pieces of seaweed, those may be able to just magically be whisked away with a click of the magic eraser, the perfect eraser. That is magic, isn't it? Let's try that one more time. No, I think I'm going to stick with the clone tool for this. And this is really what I'm going to do, just option clicking and kind of working my way all the way through this piece of seaweed until I have it removed entirely. All right, so after a few minutes working through, this piece of seaweed is gone. Let me zoom in there so you can get a good look at what is no longer there, that nice seaweed. It's just magically gone. And it was just a series of using the clone tool, working my way through that piece of seaweed and cutting it into pieces, slowly but surely, maybe about 5 to 7 minutes worth of work. From here, we'll turn that back into a smart layer, and then we'll bring it over into effects for final stylization. All right, in perfect effects, just a few things that I want to do to bring this image all the way home. First, I'm going to add dynamic contrast. It is one of my go-to filters. I'm going to add that in. And initially this is going to look a little bit too crunchy, but let's fine tune some things. I'm going to take smalls here and just nudge those up a little tiny bit. I want to see a little more pop in these tiny little details on this really main subject rock here. And I want to take back some of the large. That's looking a little bit too much. Maybe even a little nudge on the mediums too. Something like that is good. But now what I really want to avoid is some of the detail that's showing up into the water. Particularly this area of the frame is a little bit too much for me. I want that to remain soft. And then generally just the water itself. Now for this area, that's easy enough with masking bugs. I'm going to grab a bug, drop it on the scene here, and I'll rotate that around just so it's kind of this this corner, so to speak, to remove some of the dynamic contrast. Not all of it. Maybe we'll make it like partial opacity. Should take the edge off of that. Now the other thing I'll do is to avoid having the contrast touching the water, we'll go into the blending options. And this is where I can protect the highlights. And I'm going to just crank it all the way over. And so that's going to keep my water nice and soft, but everything else is getting that nice boost of contrast. That's looking great. All right, now let's take this to black and white. So we're going to add a black and white filter. There we go. And so when I start with black and white, I like to first go into the channel mixer, switch that over to color response, and hit the auto button and see what that does for me. And so that's giving me some things here. And from here, I'll modify the sliders. And so what I notice most is that I want the foreground rocks to be a little more darker. And these are a yellowy orange color. So I'm going to start with the yellow slider and pull that to the darker tones. And that's starting to look a lot better. It's popping a lot more. It's jumping out off that water, something like that. And maybe to counterbalance the oranges, start to play with the reds a little bit and just see what this is going to do for me. I'm just experimenting here, kind of seeing what looks nice. Around there is pretty good. Just those two things alone that really change the dynamic of how these rocks are interplaying with the whitewash. Something else that I'm going to take a look at, maybe a little more contrast, just a tiny bit, not a lot, and brighten the highlights maybe a little bit too. Let's see. Looks nice. One other thing I'm a big fan of with my black and whites is I love the selenium toner. I like that like plum color that it gives the shadows in particular. And just the preset setting alone, I like that. That's just my personal taste. Okay, next is a little more detail, and this time I'm going to use a tone enhancer to do that. So I certainly don't want the auto setting. That I've already done all that type of work and shaped this image, the way that I want it. What I just want to do is bump up detail, and I want to bump up the clarity, and I'm just going to start off with some settings around there, maybe back off that detail a little bit. That's pretty good, but what I don't want to do is apply this everywhere. So I really just want to have an extra amount of crispness in the foreground, but not in the background. So grab a masking bug, I'm going to drop it maybe 2/3 down into the frame here. I'm going to stretch this feather out nice, so it's encompassing, the feathering area is going to start encompassing this rock, and maybe I'll adjust my midpoint a little bit up here. And then, again, I don't want to remove it from everywhere, but just edging this off to maybe try one more notch down. Somewhere around there is good. So I've got a nice bump of detail in the foreground, but it tapers off nice and quickly to the background. So my eyes will jump into this foreground much more readily and rapidly. Last but not least, a vignette. And so I will add the vignette, and this will be a subtle one. I just want a little bit of darkening at the corners. I'm going to take the feather all the way down and the brightness down very far so I can see the edge of the vignette. And I'll play with size and with the roundness so I can get just the edges covered. Just like that. Let's see, roundness, maybe the other way. Just a little bit, so I have these corners covered, not edges, corners. There, I'll bring the feather all the way back up, and then just finally adjust the brightness for just a little touch of vignette. So around there. So there we go, that is the stylization. So Here is before and after.